The heavy, iron-scented air of Blackgate Penitentiary was thick with a tension that felt like a coiled spring. In a place where the sun was a filtered memory, and the walls were built from ancient, weeping stone, there was no such thing as a coincidence. Every movement was calculated, and every silence was a precursor to a scream. At the center of this brewing storm stood Elias, a 30-year-old former schoolteacher who looked like a ghost haunting his own life. Elias had been sent to Blackgate on a technicality, a man of books and quiet contemplation thrust into a cage filled with wolves. He was the newcomer, a term that carried the weight of a death sentence in the predatory hierarchy of the yard. The yard of Blackgate was a sprawling, concrete wasteland where the social order was enforced with sharpened steel and cold eyes. Dominating this landscape was a gang known as the Iron Brotherhood, led by a man named Thorn. Thorn was a specialist in psychological and physical demolition. He didn't just want to control the inmates, he wanted to hollow them out. For weeks, Thorn had been watching Elias, not with the intent to rob him, but with a much darker purpose. The Brotherhood followed a twisted ritual they called the sacrifice. Whenever the heat from the administration became too intense, they would pick a newcomer, someone without a crew, someone expendable, and stage a brutal event to remind the population who truly held the keys to their souls. Elias had been chosen to be the next lamb for the slaughter. The harassment began with the subtle erosion of Elias's safety. His bunk was tossed daily, his few letters from home were shredded and left on his pillow, and the whispers followed him like a shroud. He tried to stay invisible, keeping his head down and his mouth shut, but in a place like Blackgate, invisibility was an invitation for aggression. By the end of his first month, the newcomer was a hollowed-out version of the man he had once been. He sat in the yard, leaning against the cold chain-link fence, watching the horizon with a longing that was painful to witness. He didn't know that Thorn and his inner circle were already circling him. Their movements synchronized like a pack of hyenas. However, the Iron Brotherhood had overlooked a singular, terrifying factor in their equation. Located in the deepest corner of the yard, under the shadow of the North Tower, sat a man known only as the Monster. His real name had been forgotten decades ago, buried under the weight of a life sentence for an act of violence so extreme it had become prison legend. The Monster was a man of terrifying proportions, his skin a patchwork of scars and faded ink, his presence so overwhelming that a 10-foot radius around him remained permanently empty. He never spoke. He never ate in the mess hall. He simply existed as a monument to the capacity for human destruction. But behind those obsidian eyes, a remnant of a conscience was watching the schoolteacher. The confrontation reached its peak on a blistering Friday afternoon. The yard was crowded, the air shimmering with heat and the smell of hot asphalt. Thorn and 6 of his enforcers cornered Elias near the old weight piles, far from the sight lines of the board guards in the towers. They didn't bring shivs, they brought a heavy, industrial chain and a sense of theatrical cruelty. Thorn grabbed Elias by the throat, pinning him against a concrete pillar, and began to explain the sacrifice. He told the shaking man that his life was going to serve as a lesson for the rest of the yard, a reminder that in Blackgate there was no such thing as innocence, only targets. The yard went silent, a sudden, heavy vacuum of sound that signaled something had shifted in the local gravity. It wasn't the guards moving in, it was the shadow. The Monster had stood up, every head in the yard turned. It was an event that hadn't happened in years. The Monster didn't run, he walked with a slow, tectonic deliberate that seemed to make the very ground vibrate. The crowd parted like water before a prow, inmates scrambling to get out of his path. Thorn, blinded by his own arrogance, didn't notice the approach until the shadow of the giant completely eclipsed him and Elias. The Iron Brotherhood froze. The enforcers, men who prided themselves on their lack of fear, found their hands trembling as they looked up at the scarred monolith standing before them. The Monster didn't strike a blow. He didn't have to. He simply reached out and placed a hand on the concrete pillar next to Thorn's head. The sound of the stone cracking under the sheer pressure of his grip echoed like a gunshot across the yard. The Monster leaned in, his face inches from Thorn's, and for the first time in 15 years he spoke. His voice wasn't a shout, it was a low, guttural rasp that sounded like grinding tectonic plates. He gave his final warning. He told Thorn that the boy was off limits, and that if a single hair on Elias's head was touched, he would personally ensure that the Iron Brotherhood became nothing more than a memory etched into the floors of the morgue. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence that reached into the bones of every man present. Thorn, the man who thrived on fear, was now paralyzed by it. He could feel the heat radiating from the monster, the raw, untapped potential for violence that made his own crew look like children playing with sticks. He realized that his reign of terror had just collided with an ancient, unstoppable force. The monster didn't wait for an answer. He slowly retracted his hand, leaving deep indentations in the concrete, and looked at Elias. There was no warmth in that gaze. But there was a grim, unspoken understanding. Thorn and his gang backed away, their bravado shattered. They didn't just leave Elias, they fled to the other side of the yard, their power structure dissolving in a single moment of absolute clarity. The sacrifice was cancelled. The newcomer was no longer a victim, he was the ward of the most feared man in the history of the penal system. Elias stood there, gasping for air, looking at the retreating backs of his tormentors and then at the scarred back of the giant who was already walking back to his corner. As the lockdown buzzer began to wail, signaling the end of the recreation hour, the yard remained silent. The inmates filed back into the blocks. But the hierarchy had been permanently rewritten. The monster's final warning had not just saved a man's life, it had reminded the entire population that even in a place as dark as Blackgate, there were lines that could not be crossed without inviting the wrath of something much older and much more dangerous than any gang. Elias walked back to his cell, the heavy chain-link gate clanging shut behind him. But for the first time since he arrived, he didn't feel like he was walking into a tomb. He felt like he was under the shadow of a mountain. The aftermath of the monster's intervention didn't just break the Iron Brotherhood, it fractured the very foundation of Blackgate's administration, sending shockwaves through every dark corridor and guarded gatehouse. For years, Warden Sterling had maintained control by letting the gangs govern themselves through a brutal economy of fear. But a monster, who took a personal interest in a newcomer, was a variable he couldn't calculate and couldn't tolerate. To Sterling, the prison was a delicate machine of suffering, and Elias was a grain of sand that threatened to seize the gears. The warden's office, a sterile room of cold glass and sharp ambition, was filled with the acrid smoke of a man who realized his absolute grip was slipping. He knew that if the monster had started speaking, the old order of silence and subjugation was dead. He decided to play a dangerous, desperate game. He would use Elias as a lever to pry secrets from the giant or to provoke him into an act of violence so extreme it would justify his permanent disposal by a tactical squad. Elias was summoned to the administrative wing under the guise of a mandatory safety review. The walk through the prison was fundamentally different now. The corridors that used to be gauntlets of hisses, threats, and predatory eyes were now silent aisles of profound respect. Inmates stepped back as he passed, their gazes lowered as if he carried the aura of the giant with him. But inside the warden's office, the air was even more treacherous than the yard. Sterling offered Elias a deal that sounded like salvation. He would be transferred to a minimum security facility, his record reviewed for early release, and his safety guaranteed if he would act as an informant. The warden wanted to know every word the monster had whispered, why he had chosen to protect a schoolteacher, and what kind of storm was brewing in that corner of the yard. Elias looked at the man across the desk, a man who wore a three-piece suit but possessed a soul far more hollow and predatory than any inmate, and felt a cold, crystalline resolve. He told the warden that the monster hadn't asked for a single thing. And therefore, there was nothing to tell. It was a refusal that sealed his fate in Sterling's eyes. When Elias was returned to the block, he found the atmosphere had turned volatile and electric. Thorn, humiliated in front of his peers and desperate to reclaim his shattered status, had been given a green light by corrupt guards who were eager to see the status quo restored. The Iron Brotherhood knew they couldn't face the monster head-on in the light of day. so they waited for the one moment when the giant was most vulnerable, the midnight maintenance transfer, a time when the deep block cleaning crews moved through the facility. As the clock struck 12, the power was suddenly cut, a standard tactic for a sanctioned hit that wouldn't appear on the official logs. The only light came from the dim, emergency red strobes that turned the hallway into a scene of rhythmic, pulsing nightmares. Thorn and the remnants of his crew didn't go for the monster's cell. They believed that if they could finish the sacrifice, in the dark, the monster would have nothing left to protect and would sink back into his silent, broken apathy. They moved like shadows through the red gloom, their shivs glinting in the periodic flashes of light. Elias, hearing the heavy grinding of his cell door being forced open by a master key, stood in the center of his small cage. He didn't have a weapon, only a heavy, leather-bound book he had been allowed to keep. Just as Thorn's shadow crossed the threshold, a sound echoed through the block that made the blood of every man in Blackgate run cold. It was the sound of a bolted steel bunk being ripped from the concrete floor of the corner cell. It was the sound of a legend waking up. The monster didn't just walk this time, he arrived like a collapsing building, a tidal wave of muscle and repressed history. In the strobe-lit chaos, his massive form appeared in terrifying flashes, a shoulder here, a scarred fist there, moving through Thorn's enforcers with the relentless force of an avalanche. He didn't use a shiv or a chain, he used the raw, unadulterated power of a man who had long ago traded his soul for a set of rules. The hallway became a symphony of breaking wood, gasping lungs, and the wet thud of bodies hitting the floor. Thorn, finding himself trapped between the monster and the very cell he had intended to turn into a tomb, realized his mistake with a clarity that only comes when death is inches away. The giant didn't kill him, he simply pinned him to the bars of the tier with one hand, his grip so tight the steel began to groan and warp under the pressure. The final warning was no longer a whisper. The monster spoke again, his voice booming like a heavy funeral bell through the darkness of the block, reaching every ear from the intake rooms to the solitary units. He told the entire prison, and the guards watching through the thermal cameras in the control room, that Blackgate no longer belonged to those who sought to rule it through fear. He declared that the sacrifice was over, and from this night on, the only law in the yard would be the law of the man who had seen the bottom of the pit and survived. He looked at Elias through the bars, his breathing heavy but controlled, a silent command for the teacher to step out of the shadows and take his place as a witness to the new world. By the time the tactical teams arrived to restore power and regain control, the Iron Brotherhood was a shattered memory, their influence dissolved in the red strobe light. Thorn was found weeping on the floor, his spirit broken more thoroughly than his body. He was a king who had seen the face of a god and realized he was nothing. The monster was sitting back in his corner cell, his hands folded in his lap, looking as if he hadn't moved in a century. But the atmosphere of the prison had changed irrevocably. Elias stood beside his cell door, no longer a ghost or a victim, but a man who had found his footing in the most unlikely of places. The Warden's plan had backfired with catastrophic results. Instead of breaking the monster, he had created a partnership of intellect and power that the administration could no longer hope to control. The aftermath saw the largest federal investigation in the history of Blackgate Penitentiary. Warden Sterling was removed from the premises in handcuffs. His management tactics revealed to be a complex web of corruption, illegal hits, and administrative negligence. Elias's case, highlighted by the chaos, was fast-tracked for judicial review. It turned out the technicality that had sent him there was indeed a gross miscarriage of justice. Within months, the massive, iron-studded gates of the Weeping Stone prison opened for him. On the day of his release, Elias didn't look at the cameras of the news crews or the lawyers waiting with their paperwork. He walked back to the far corner of the yard one last time. The monster was there, a silent mountain of a man sitting in the pale winter sun. Elias didn't say thank you, words were too small for what had passed between them. Instead, he simply left a book on the concrete, a copy of the Odyssey, and a small, handwritten note tucked into the pages. He turned and walked toward the gate, the sound of his footsteps echoing with a newfound confidence. As Elias walked out into the world of fresh air, endless horizons, and the scent of rain, the monster finally reached out and picked up the book. His massive fingers, which had warped steel and broken men, turned the first page with surprising tenderness. He saw the note Elias had left. The journey home begins with a single act of courage. You are not a monster, you are the man who remembered how to be a hero. For the first time in 20 years, the giant didn't look at the gray ground or the concrete walls. He looked up at the high, blue sky beyond the barbed wire, and for a fleeting, beautiful second, the monster was gone, replaced by a man who realized that his own journey wasn't over. The yard remained silent as the inmates watched the giant look at the horizon, but it was a different kind of silence, a silence filled with the possibility of redemption, and a deep respect for the teacher who had reminded a mountain how to move.